Hey folks, I'm Dennis. Thanks for watching my video. Today I'm going to show you how to change the inner and outer wheel bearings on a rear wheel drive car or truck with disc brakes. Thanks for watching. Let's get started. Anytime you replace the front wheel bearings on a car or truck, I recommend that you replace both the inner and the outer bearings on both the left and the right side of the vehicle. I wouldn't do one side and not do the other, and I wouldn't do the inner or the outer without doing the other. You're going to need to be able to take the wheel off your vehicle. You're going to need to be able to take the brake caliper off your vehicle, and then on some vehicles you have to take the caliper bracket. Like on this particular truck, you have to take the bracket off to get the rotor off, so I have to remove both of those. Some vehicles you don't have to take the bracket off because it's just a rear mount and the caliper goes into it and bolts in from the rear and it's not in your way, but on this particular one it is. And then I'll show you how to take the rotor off. You're also going to need a hammer. You're going to need at least one brass punch or a drift to install your new races. You need some bearing grease. Now be careful when you buy your grease. It needs to say wheel bearing grease. You can't use like white lithium grease or anything like that. It needs to be wheel bearing grease. And you'll probably need a pair of channel locks, piece of wire, and a bunch of oil rags because it's a pretty messy job. On this one, I believe I can just remove the bracket itself with the caliper still in place. So I'm going to try that first. A lot of times the bracket bolts are hard to get out because they're Loctited or they haven't been moved for a long time, so you'll need a breaker bar. And usually the bolts on these brackets are pretty good sized bolts. And then just like if you were doing a brake job, you may have to clamp your caliper to squeeze it open a little bit so that you can get the caliper off the rotor. Just like that. If your shoes are loose or your pads are loose, I'd pull them out so you don't drop them. And then so you don't strain your brake line, just take a piece of scrap wire or something and wire your caliper and bracket up here like around the shock tower or something like that so it can't fall. Now, all depends on who you talk to as to how people get these dust caps off. You can either go in here with a chisel or screwdriver behind the lip, get it in there and go around and pry it off, which I find very difficult. So I just take a pair of channel locks. You got to be careful not to crush it so you don't knock it out around. You probably will make some dents in it, but as long as you don't knock it out around, it's fine. Then you can kind of walk it out. But that's how that dust cap looks, and it just, all it is to keep crud from getting in your wheel hub, cover up your bearings. The other thing I like to do when I'm doing a bearing job is lay down an oil rag and keep all my parts setting on the rag. That way I don't lose anything. You'll have a cotter pin in here, and there'll either be a nut with a keeper nut or just a castle nut, one or the other. It's easier if you use needle nose pliers. Don't have to, but it's easier to get in there and get them. And just bend those back straight and it'll come right out. It's not really recommended to reuse cotter pins. You should get a new one, but they will not come with your bearings. Either it's going to be one castle nut or you'll have like a castellated keeper nut that goes on the outside, and then you'll have that nut. They're generally not very tight, nor should they be very tight, so you can usually just get them off with a pair of channel locks or something without having to worry about getting a wrench. And you take that off. There's going to be a washer here, so what you do now, you got the nut off, take your hand on your rotor and kind of rock it a little bit, and it'll squeeze that bearing out of there. And then you can there's a keyed washer that goes in there, and it'll either have a key in it stamped into it, or it'll have like two flat sides or one flat side on the bore in the middle, something to keep it straight. Just depends on your car. And then your bearing. Now that's your outer bearing. Then you can just pull the whole rotor off. You don't have to clean all of this spindle off. Like in this particular case, because this truck is older and it's got a lot of miles on it, I'm going to at least clean the spindle off so I can check the bearing surfaces and make sure they're not grooved or anything like that. Here's how bearings work. They'll come in a little box, depending on the size of the bearing. So these gloves are terrible. These are cheap latex gloves, and every time I do something, I tear the fingertip off on one of them. You got the bearing itself, which is this, and then you have the race. So you can see how it's tapered, so it's smaller on the inside than it is on the outside. Well, the race is the same way. So the bearing has to fit in the race like this to work right. Well, the races are pressed into the hub on the front and the back. What we have to do is we'll have to remove the grease seal on the back. I'll show you that in a minute. And then we have to knock the bearing races out and put the new ones in. The inner bearing has a seal, which is this rubber part, and then this flange that's on the inside of the hub. Well, I don't recommend ever reusing the seals either. All of this should be replaced as you use it. You can just get an edge up underneath it like so. And you could use a chisel, because yes, I know you're not supposed to use a screwdriver like this, but that's the way it goes. There you go. So now that popped out. So that's what your grease seal looks like. Then you've got your inner bearing, which looks just like your outer, except it's bigger OD usually. And then the race here. And then usually lots of extra grease on the inside. Sometimes if it's real nasty in there, if there's a lot of dirt, if the seal has failed, something like that, you actually might want to take this hub and clean it up, you know, with in a parts washer or something like that to get all the grease out. So here's the race. It's going to be the shiny surface that you can see right in here. On the back side of the race is a little bit of a lip. There's going to be a lip on the hub, which is what determines how deep it goes when you put the new one in. But they make it so that the thick part of the race sticks out past the lip in the hub a little bit, so you can get a punch on it from the back side so you can knock it out. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in with a punch through the hub hole. I'm going to go in through the back side to knock out the front, the outer bearing race, and then I'm going to flip it over and come in from the front to knock out the inner bearing race. And I'm going to get it on this lip and go around with a punch and knock it out. You take your punch and just start going around that lip like so until you knock it out. Now some hubs will actually have like 2 detents or recesses right behind each race, and you just hit one side, hit the other, one side, hit the other until it comes out. So you can see now how that race is coming out. It's almost flush with this hub. There you go. You see how that pops out. So now on the back side, you're going to come in through the front, and you can see my punch in there. Like that's the back edge of the bearing race. So you just go all the way around, hammering that out, and then that race is going to come out as well. And then there you go. So I've got, that's my outer, which I showed you a little while ago. This is my inner. And then this is my bearing seal. And I verified that they were the right parts as best I could. I know that these are right because I've already done the other side, but what you want to do before you grease these is hold them up to your the bearing that you just took out and make sure it's at least the same size. As long as it's the same size, the inside, the outside, and the thickness, it'll be all right, more than likely. These are going to be covered with just a light machine oil. That is not enough to lubricate them. I'm going to show you in a little bit how to grease these. But you got to take your bearing race. Now, you have to be careful. Make sure you put the race in the right way. The bearing won't go in this way because it's tapered, so it won't fit. So your bearing has to go in that way. That means the race has to go in this way. That's the best way to verify it. There is a thick side and a thin side. The thin side will always go to the outside of the hub, so on the inner and the outer. But that's the easiest way. If you can put your bearing in the race and then set the race there, now you know you got your race turned the right way, and then set your bearing off to the side. Be careful not to get grit and dirt, sand, anything like that in your bearing. You want it to stay clean before and after we grease it. Now you can do this one of a couple ways. I've seen people do it different ways. You don't want to strike your new race with anything that's hardened steel. So you don't want to you don't want to use like your regular hammer or your steel punch, something like that. So I just take a dead blow hammer and get it started. You want to be careful not to get it cockeyed in there, because if you get it cockeyed, it's not going to go. So that's as far as I can get it with a dead blow, because now it's flush. So now's where your brass punch comes in. You want to use brass. I'd still use safety glasses, but you want to use brass because if you hit a hardened steel tool onto a hardened steel bearing race, something's going to chip. You don't want your race to chip, for one thing, then it's no good. And you also don't want a chip to fly off. They will definitely embed themselves in your skin or in your eye, something like that. You don't want any of that. So then you take your brass punch and you do the same thing that we did to get it out in reverse. You just go around. I start off kind of lightly to get it started. And then once you kind of get it in there a little bit, you get it behind that recess. Like so, you can start hitting on it a little bit harder. The idea is to push it down in there as evenly as possible. And then there's a lip back here that you'll see once you take your old race out, and you got to get the new race all the way down to that lip. If you see any brass chips as you're doing this, you want to get them out of there. So after you get your inner race in, you want to go ahead and put the outer race in before you put the bearing in that in. That way, if you do get any brass chips down in there, you can clean them out. So we're going to put the outer race in exactly like we did the inner race. Make sure that it seats all the way down onto this lip in here. Now what we need to do is take our bearing grease and load the bearings. I'm only going to show you how to load one of them because it's the same. So I've got to do the inner first. So I'm going to start with it. So take your bearing, and you'll notice on the back side, the outside of the bearing, is a little more open than the front side. There's a little more of a gap there. So what you want to do is we're going to load the bearing from this side. And we're going to make sure your hands are clean and your bearing's not dirty. We're going to take a palm full of grease. We're going to take the bearing, we're going to start squishing it in there. And you have to take your time with this step because you want to make sure that you get grease all the way to the other side, that all of the rollers are covered in grease and there's a good layer of grease all the way on the inside of this cage. Otherwise your bearing will prematurely wear out. I just give me a good old glob like that, stick it in my palm and start pressing it in there. And just go all the way around till you got that in there. You can scoop that out, get it on there and do the same thing and just keep going. You notice I'm turning the bearing as I go, and I'm pushing it into my palm so that it's pushing the grease into the bearing. You can look inside of here and you can tell that grease is not coming between the rollers, so you don't have enough grease in it yet. So like here, see, I'm starting to squish out there, so I'm getting there. Not quite though. I'll get this cage and get that inner bearing and turn it just a little bit. And work it back and forth a little bit to make sure I've got grease good in there. So it looks to me like I'm a little light on this side, so I'm going to squeeze some more in there. And that looks pretty good to me. I like to put a layer on the race. All good. And then you can drop your bearing in there. Now we got to put the inner seal in. They may look a little different depending on the car, but they're generally all the same. It's going to have a flange on one side and not on the other, which means it's going to go in like that with the flange to the outside. I'll generally put these in with a dead blow hammer or like a plastic face hammer is fine, something like that. So get it in there, kind of get it in place with your hand and just start kind of tapping it in. Make sure you drive it all the way home. The inner is now done. So now you take your rotor, put it back on the spindle, support the weight of it, take your outer bearing that's already been greased and put it in. Get it as far in there, you know, as you can, finger tight with the into the race. Take the washer, however yours lines up with a keyway or a flat spot, put it on the back side of the outer bearing. Take the spindle nut, put it on. Taking the weight off of the rotor, you can finish tightening it up to finger tight. Get it as tight as you can with your fingers. So I don't really show this on the video, but what you want to do is take your channel locks, tighten the spindle nut up so much that the rotor won't spin, and then back off of it a quarter of a turn. That'll give you about the right torque setting. Some of the specs that you read call for 15 to 20 pounds of torque if you want to use a torque wrench on it. Then give it a couple of spins and then check it for play horizontally and vertically. What you shouldn't feel any play in that bearing once it's tight enough. Then take your castellated keeper nut, put it on. There's the hole, you know, goes through the spindle for the cotter pin, and what you'll find is that the slots for the cotter pin and the ridges for the nut are offset a bit, so you can turn that castellated nut until you get a hole that lines up. Use a new cotter pin, put that in, bend the ears around, of course, to keep it from coming out. Needle nose pliers are the easiest thing to use for that. Bend them all the way up, and that way you won't have to worry about them getting in the way of the dust cap. Take the dust cap, I like to use a dead blow hammer, tap it on, make sure you get it all the way home. Then you're pretty much done. So thanks for watching my video. I appreciate it. Give it a thumbs up if you would. Leave comments and hit the subscribe button below. I hope to see you back soon. Thanks for watching. God bless you.